Hello, this is Anthony Gorhan, and in the previous two installments of this series I discussed broadly the nature of grammar and its essential components, particularly in connection with English, and discussed tense as well as phrase structure. Now I'd like to move on to talk about this second element of the verb phrase in English after tense, which is aspect. Now, aspect provides us either with a sense of the temporality of the event, in other words, its time-boundedness, its duration, or of its relationship in some way to the moment of speaking. Now, there are two aspects in English. There's progressive or continuous aspect and perfect aspect. We typically use the progressive or the continuous aspect either to indicate something in progress or ongoing about the event at the moment of speaking, or to suggest its background nature in a narrative. For example, we're decorating the house, or I was just walking in feeling well happy with myself when without by your leave she burst out crying. Here we have the continuous or progressive aspect in we're decorating the house or I was just walking in. To say these things are either time limited, like we're decorating the house at the moment, or I was just walking in is something that was in progress at the time when something more significant for the narrative, in this case she burst out crying, occurred. Now, perfect aspect is something we use to suggest or imply some anterior relationship or backward-looking relationship between the event or the state that we're describing and the moment of speaking, or another element in what we're saying. For example, I've been married for 10 years is looking back from the point of speaking to the point at which this state started. I failed because I hadn't revised thoroughly enough. I hadn't revised, past perfect aspect, to look back to this point of not revising enough from the time perspective of failing. We can also use this to look back at something from a point in the future, like Bradley Manning will have been detained without trial for 4 years come the end of May. It might even be 5 years by now. But the same principle applies. We establish a point of speaking or a point of perspective, and then we look back from that. Now, both aspects, progressive and perfect, can be employed in combination with either tense and in combination with each other to produce more detailed and grammatically complex utterances, like I hadn't been waiting long before she arrived, past perfect continuous. I've been expecting you, she said, present perfect continuous. Were you looking for anything in particular? Past continuous. Now, as well as aspect and tense, we have in English and in many other languages the capacity to add what we call mood to our utterances. Now, mood is essentially how the speaker feels about the possibility, probability, necessity, or desirability of an event or a state that they're describing. There are two basic ways of establishing mood in English. We either use modals, more properly called modal auxiliaries, or we use semi-modals, which behave in a similar way in terms of meaning, but differently in terms of their form, or through lexical devices. Now, when we use modal auxiliaries, we're talking about using words like can, could, should, must, etc. And when we are talking about using semi-modals, we're talking about using things like ought to, have to, used to, need to. Now, some of these have relationships in terms of the meanings they can convey. For example, must and have to can be used to convey the same kinds of meanings, but they behave differently grammatically. They have different grammatical limits. For example, I must, you must, he must, they must, doesn't matter. Whereas I have to, you have to, but he, she, it has to. Equally, must can't be put in the past tense. There's no musted. Whereas have to can be had to. So semimodals behave grammatically, morphologically differently from modal auxiliaries, even though they may be used to do the same kind of job. And we also have other lexical devices, often adverbials, that we can employ, like probably, possibly, likely, inevitably, etc. Now, in the final installation or installment of this series, I'd like to talk about voice, and it's getting its own installment because it's at one and the same time an extremely simple area of grammar, but an extremely misrepresented and misunderstood one. So I'd like to take some time to iron that out by itself. Thanks for following so far. See you in the next installment.